Hi, I'm Zibby Owens, and you're listening to the award-winning podcast, Moms Don't Have Time to Read Books. If you like this podcast, you will love my new anthology called Moms Don't Have Time to Have Kids. Check it out, and you'll hear from 49 authors about all sorts of things moms don't have time to do. All the authors have been on this podcast. Also, check out my TikTok @with Zibby and Tracy, my other podcast, Sex Talk with Zibby and Tracy. Check out Moms Don't Have Time to Write on Medium. And of course, my new publishing company called Zibby Books. And now back to our daily author interview site and a quick hello from some of my kids. Hi.
Hi.
Hello. Enjoy the show. David Damrosch is the author of Around the World in 80 Books. David is the Ernest Birnbaum Professor of Comparative Literature and Chair of Comparative Literature at Harvard University and Director of Harvard's Institute for World Literature. He is the author or editor of 25 books, including What is World Literature?, The Buried Book, Comparing the Literatures, and the 6-volume Longman Anthology of World Literature. He has lectured in 50 countries around the world, and his online Harvard course, Masterpieces of World Literature, has been taken by nearly 100,000 people. Wow. Welcome, David. Thank you so much for coming on Moms Don't Have Time to Read Books to discuss Around the World in 80 Books.
Thank you so much for having me.
It's my pleasure. First of all, I love the sort of genius inspiration for how you picked these books and the whole Jules Verne structure of it, how it started in COVID, how you started it online, and how you brought it to be this book in book form as well. So I was hoping you could just quickly touch on that. And then I would love to maybe delve into a couple of the places that you visited that I found particularly interesting.
Absolutely.
So, okay.
Yes, so I had this idea a few years ago to do a book for a general audience about world literature, which I've written about a lot and taught for academic circles, but thinking how to bring a wider audience to the excitement of all of the great works we have now. It seemed to me that the narrative thread would be this going around the world in 80 books. It seemed about the right volume of number of books to look at. And sort of the idea then crystallized with COVID that since I couldn't travel, I had thought I'd do the book as connected to a series of places I've been and was going to, but then all these conferences got canceled, Tokyo and Europe, around the world. So I thought, well, I can't do it after all. But then I thought, well, I have the books, and so I can go around the world with these books. So then I organized it as 16 chapters, which in the summer before last was 16 weeks, 5 books a day, 5 days a week, one book per day, 5 days a week, leaving the weekends free to have a kind of fiction of some break in this time that was all falling in on itself. And it was quite an experience doing it in that very concentrated way. The challenge, not just to write 1,500 words a day, but every day a different book to shift gears. But it also meant that everything was there in my mind at the same time. And that it really made it much more connected and much more conversational in the blog form, that certainly the book is still there. I would having these interactions with readers around the world, and it changed the shape of the book. For example, Rabindranath Tagore is in the book. He wasn't going to be there, but then one of my followers in Delhi said, how can you come to India and not have Tagore? So we have Tagore.
Well, I think calling it like even derivative of a blog it makes it seem less academic or less, I mean, it's so polished. I felt, it's been a while since I've been in school and I miss school. I loved school. So this book made me feel like I took this mini course. Like you're very accessible in the way you write, right? Like your tone and it's not so heavy-handed that you feel like you can't understand even if you're just, in the midst of busy life. And yet it's this new sort of academic and yet, I don't know, just very fresh approach to analyzing literature, I guess is what I'm trying to say, but not very well, obviously, this morning. Anyway, all to say, I got through this and I was like, I feel like I just took a class and I didn't have to go anywhere. And not only did I take a class, but I got to travel the world and learn a little bit about every place I already thought I knew a little bit about. And so I found it just really amazing and refreshing and have so much respect for you and your whole career to date. And I was like, okay, well, here we go. Time to go to class.
Thank you so much. And I will say that the blog form, it was both more conversational and kind of more relaxed, also more visual because online. So I had a lot of illustrations and I kept doing this. We have 80 illustrations along with the 80 books, or actually 81 because there's an epilogue about the 81st book. But also having just the half a day to write and the 1,500 words, it made me, I had to just decide what's really essential. What did I really want to show? what key scene, what key moment, what verses, and then what key connections to other works in that chapter and other chapters. So it really focused and also relaxed the book a lot.
Interesting. So you start the journey in London, and we
As
go
did
through.
Phileas Fogg, of course, in Round the World in 8 Days, then have to come back at the end, just by the very last day. And he makes it, he's Around the World in 80 Days. He thinks he's missed it by a day because he's delayed, but then he discovers because of the international dateline, he's gained a day, and it comes in 8:45 in the evening, 5 minutes before he'd promised to be back. And so on the 80th day, I actually posted my last posting at that time of day, Greenwich Mean Time, to match his model.
Wow. You don't miss a detail here. You start in London, and then I found some of the chapter about that delves into the Holocaust and your own family history. So chapter 3 is Krakow after Auschwitz. So tell listeners a little bit about was it your great-great-grandfather, great-great-grandfather Leopold Damrosch, and his violin career, and then all of these amazing authors. I mean, I learned more about Primo Levi here than I had known. Okay, anyway. All right, let's one thing at a time. I'm very excited if you can't tell. Talk about your own family history and how you almost, as you so profoundly say in the book, we almost weren't having this conversation today had your family not left where they were.
It was one of the things that emerged increasingly as the book went on is I decided it's a very personal book. It's partly kind of a memoir of a life of reading. But also I wanted to just use examples of how literature feeds into our own lives and how it's reflected, how we read is reflected by what's going on in our life, what's happened in our lives. And personal histories, family histories came in. And so I'd started with very upbeat chapters in London and Paris by and large, though the Paris chapter, each one leads into the next. So the last Paris book is Georges Perec, the son of Polish emigres who die in World War II, and he's trying to reconstruct that. So then we go to Krakow, and one of my followers on the blog said, "Oh, so dark, so soon." But it actually was important to think that literature is both uplifting and invigorating and deals with the traumas of life. And we connect to the struggles we've gone through, or that we know people have gone through, our families have gone through. So in the case of Poland, I was giving a talk to the Conrad Festival there, and my great-great-grandfather was this German Jewish musician in what was then German territory. He was born in 1832. He leaves in 1850 to go to medical school in Berlin. He's a good son. He's going to do a proper profession like his dad wants him to do. But then he really wants to be a violinist. And he finishes a medical degree and doesn't do another thing with medicine, becomes a violinist, becomes Franz Liszt's first violinist. Liszt was the godfather for my great-grandfather, Franz Jr., Frank, as he became in the US. But then he's kind of a glass ceiling. He feels he's not getting anywhere in his career, and he moves to the United States. So I'm going back. It's the first time in Poland, and my hosts take me to around in Poznan, where he'd grown up. And amazingly, they found the gymnasium records, the high school records, with the addresses, and you could see where he'd lived. We went to these places; they were still there. And I was thinking, boy, gee, wouldn't it be nice? The beautiful old town. Suppose he'd never left. And of course, I know that generations later it would have been a whole different family, but my own father was named Leopold after this very same Leopold. So I was imagining, suppose I'd been there, reading Conrad in Polish translation, eating sausages instead of Big Macs growing up. But then after Poznan, my host drive me on to Krakow, and on the way just outside town, we come to the sign for Auschwitz. I thought, if we'd never left, that's where it would have been. And that then leads into the discussion of these Holocaust-based things, and also these, fantastic Nobel Prize winner poet Czesław Miłosz, reflecting back on his own past and memory and survival, and making it all into art.
Wow, beautiful. I actually loved how you brought in your own family history, even your trips with your wife, Lori. I feel like she's such a great character in this book who just pops in and out. So I loved how you wrote with her about
and
her.
And our 3 kids, each one makes an appearance in the course of the book. So we're very sympathetic to the idea of moms have trouble finding, dads also have trouble finding time to read, I must say.
I have thought about starting a dad's podcast as well, but I just haven't gotten there yet. I've been trying to get my husband to do it. But I don't know.
Exactly. But he doesn't have time.
But he doesn't have time. Yeah, exactly. I think he'd rather do a sports podcast than a book podcast, but that's okay. Yeah. Well, anyway, the way you trace through these authors, through Kafka and anti-Semitism and the cultural political trends in Europe and everything that was going on, and these poems that you included here were just beautiful. I mean, even can I just read one of these poems? This is by, do you pronounce it Ceylan? Ceylan?
Ceylan.
Ceylan, right?
Either Ceylan or Ceylan if you use a Romanian pronunciation or a German pronunciation. Yeah.
I'm going to go Ceylan because I don't know. I have German roots somewhere. Okay. Black milk of daybreak. We drink it at evening. We drink it at midday and morning. We drink it at night. We drink and we drink. We shovel a grave in the air where you won't lie too cramped. And then it ends with death, a master in Germany shooting a woman. He shoots you with shot made of lead, shoots you level and true. A man lives in the house, your goldenest Har Margaret. He looses his hounds on us, grants us a grave in the air. He plays with his vipers and daydreams. Der Tod ist ein, Meister aus Deutschland. Meister aus Deutschland. Okay, well, maybe I shouldn't have read that. But anyway, these beautiful poems. And then it goes to shorter and shorter, and you sort of track the evolution of Ceylan's writing as it becomes more sparse until his eventual depression and hospitalization before suicide at age 50, which is awful. The shofar place, deep in the glowing text void at torch height in the time hole, here deep in with your mouth. I mean, these are they're chilling. These passages are seriously just chilling. Like, how do you feel going through them again? And how did you even figure out which little pieces to pick and include and move us with?
That's such an interesting, was challenging for me because I'm much more used to having 50 pages to talk about an author in a chapter, or an hour or 3 hours in a classroom, and now just 1,500 words, 1,600 words, equivalent of 5 pages, 10 minutes. It really enforces to get to what really matters the most. That poem that you read by Ceylan is probably his single most famous poem, and it relates to these themes. And then I'm finding things that will connect up. A lot of the pleasure doing the book was finding things that unexpected connections back and forth, someone referring to somebody else. I thought, oh, wait a minute. Virginia Woolf, I remember she wrote some essay on Dickens. I hadn't looked at it in years. And then I find this fantastic, interesting essay on Dickens that makes a connection like that. So those things that will really work. Or with Proust, what I found I loved in teaching with the famous episode of the Petite Madeleine, that he dips this little beautiful cookie and he makes this whole mythology around it that's feminine, that's moist, it's round, it's like a seashell, it's like the town he lives in, all of these things. But the original version they first wrote, it's just autobiographical, it's a piece of toast. I think, now what happens when a piece of toast becomes a beautiful Madeleine? So it seems to me like a moment like that just gives you the essence of a writer and of an experience.
Wow. Yes, I remember reading about the Madeleine in college during my literature classes. And anyway, I think of that, of course, whenever now in a cup of coffee at a nice restaurant where they sometimes have these little things like,
absolutely.
Okay. Anyway, so then you continue taking us through the world, all through, Mexico, Beijing, Bar Harbor. And then I was very excited to get to the New York chapter, which is where I am right now.
Uh-huh.
And to hear about, Saul Steinberg and how you analyze the drawings, and back to what you were saying about the visual, and James Baldwin and how he went back to Paris and his writing, and Tolkien. And I mean, this is like such a full, robust experience. So take us through a little bit through New York.
Yes. So my last chapter is in New York. My next last chapter, as I mentioned, Bar Harbor, Maine, which I was born. And I thought, once by the end of the book, people gotten to know me a little bit and bring the personal out a bit more. So, and in Maine, it's my first encounter with literature as a kid, and to me, it's very important that what we read as children sets the whole tone for us, and certainly anyone who's read to their own kids. And indeed, I read the entire Lord of the Rings to our kids when they were little, and a very meaningful, moving experience. I would say for all of us. And with New York, so we moved there when I was 10, and my whole adolescence was there. And that's when I first met actual professional writers. Madeleine L'Engle was a parishioner of my father's in his church, and she just published a Wrinkle in Time. And sort of encountering these people, in both Steinberg and also Saul Bellow, I met through a high school English teacher of mine who knew them both. And she becomes a kind of a fairy tale donor figure in the course of the book. And it's discovering this cosmopolitan world, discovering the world in New York. and how many, it's a migrant world, of course. I had myself come to New York from away, as we say in Maine, from away, meaning anywhere off Mount Desert Island, and sort of coming to a sense of this world. So then I end with Tolkien as the way to come back to England at the very end, following Phileas Fogg. And Tolkien, to me, is a fantastically interesting writer. He was so important to me. I probably read it 10 times as a teenager, but I teach him now. I teach him very differently as the last of the great World War I poets, which might not be how one would think of him. But he was in the trenches in World War I, and almost all of his friends died. He just was lucky. He was wounded and invalided back out. So these kinds of experience and how they figure into this fantasy world and how reality comes into fantasy, it's sort of the very epitome of the book as a whole.
And you applied that also to Madeleine L'Engle and how she had this very isolated childhood. Yeah. And how she kept trying to write about it and getting rejected, which I didn't even know that story.
10 whole years,
selling and selling until finally she writes this fantasy and that sells. And how she says that kids understand some of these things way faster. And you have this whole diagram and that you don't need to over-explain it, right? Like kids pick up on fantasy immediately, which I also found fascinating because, of course, she becomes, I don't know, one of the greats of all time. Anyway.
Exactly. No, and I think that's, I think we should all remain in close touch with our childhood selves, and that sense of adventure and exploration is so important. And this book is a very childlike book in that respect, just the pleasure of discovery.
It's funny, I wrote this memoir that's coming out in July called Bookends, a memoir of love, loss, and literature. And in it, I go through like 200 plus books that for me were important because I don't know about you, like whenever I think of a moment, happy, sad, whatever, like I know what I was reading and where I was and which book meant a lot to me. And some of it's just random, right? I just happened to be reading it at the time, but it will forever be etched in my memory with that time. So mine was far less academic, far less intellectual, but but still a journey of a life through books because books for so many of us are so essential that they're our companions as we go through life. And that's why I particularly appreciated this sort of deep dive into your reading world. And even though it's much more highbrow literary, perhaps.
I also have detective stories, several of them, Donna Leon in Venice and Dror Mashani in Israel, Sherlock Holmes. It's as much a part of our experience of literature as anything else. And I'm interested in this very fluid boundary between the elite and the popular. Orhan Pamuk was one of my 80 authors. He deliberately modeled a lot of his books on detective stories because that's the way to reach a world audience.
Mm-hmm. Very true. And so when you read for fun, like when you're not analyzing or doing this type of investigation and analysis and whatever, what do you like to read? Like, what are you reading tonight when you go, like, when do you read? Like, do you read before bed or like, what's your pleasure reading schedule like?
Usually at night. I'm reading a Dutch novel now that was just sent to me. There's a great press called Archipelago Books. If you're interested in really cool stuff, Archipelago Books based in Brooklyn. And they do beautiful little editions of translations of things that you probably never heard of. They did very well because they picked up on Karl Ove Knausgaard's My Struggle. They become his American publisher, and this has helped float a lot of their other publications. But so I'm reading a Dutch novel from mid-century called A Guardian Angel Remembers. It's a very ironic, satiric thing set at the time of the German invasion of World War of the Netherlands in World War II, and that's for fun. It happens also. I'm teaching a course now on The Philosopher and the Tyrant, which ends up with Hitler and Heidegger and Hannah Arendt. And I just read another Hitler biography. I've read several, so that was not exactly fun, but absolutely fascinating. And now that this satirical novel is a fun way of thinking about these troubled times.
You wrote a lot about translation in this book and the merits of reading work in translation and how to do that. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, when I was growing up in the pre-modern era, as a student in the 70s, in my field of comparative literature, you weren't supposed to use translation. You're supposed to just learn languages and only read in the original, which is a great idea, but it means you can't read very many works around the world. I mean, I certainly spent more than my share of time studying a dozen or so languages, but there's a lot more languages out there than those few. Like I've never studied Dutch, for example. Am I going to never read any Dutch literature because I haven't had the time to study Dutch? Well, no. And it didn't stop, Shakespeare from reading Virgil and Homer and learning a lot from them, or Derek Walcott from reading Homer and Virgil and Dante in translation. We're in a golden age of translation right now. There's so many good translations being brought out, translations and retranslations of so many books. The Tale of Genji, the great Heian masterpiece from Murasaki Shikibu, has now had 4 full translations in English in the last few decades, each one better than the last. It's an amazing, amazing time.
Amazing. Do you have particular translators or one translation that you have found, or have you ever been tempted with your languages to translate yourself?
Well, in fact, there is one of my 80 books I have just translated, fantastic Congolese novel written in French in the 70s. It's called Jean-Baptiste Vico, Le Viol du Discours Africain, Jean-Baptiste Vico, or The Rape of African Discourse. And Vico is not the Italian philosopher of a similar name, but he is a kind of self-promoting African intellectual who wants to write the great African novel so that he can be invited to conferences in Paris and Rome. And this hilarious academic satire, basically, of this. And it's very complicated. I mean, it's a cultural situation, and it's a satire on the Mobutu regime, slightly in disguise, because you couldn't quite say that openly. But it was never translated, published in 1975. It didn't really serve anybody's interests because it was satirizing both the Westernizers and the Afrocentrists and the politics. And about 15 years ago, I was saying, well, world literature will really have grown up when a work like this can be translated and read. So I decided finally to put my time where my mouth is, and I translated it. It's just coming out next month in a dual language edition, so it'll be available in French and in English. But translations have been very important. I've only read Tale of Genji in translation because I don't read Japanese. And even in French, let's say, Moncrief's translation of Proust is amazingly good. And I've taught it in French, and I teach it in English. And I'm, in a way, as happy with the English translation. It's just beautiful. And Moncrief has a feel for the flow of those sentences, and that's what matters so much.
Is there anything you look for in a student? I know you've been teaching a long time. Is there a student? Is there some spark or something that you see in a student and you're like, this is why I do this? Something like that. Have you had an experience like that?
Oh, that's the great pleasure of teaching, for sure, is finding those students. And students with just an open-ended curiosity. And I'm particularly happy to find students who just have an ear for language. I think there's lots of academics who go into literature because, I don't know, it didn't work out for them in philosophy or sociology. And they're interested in great ideas, and ideas are wonderful. But in literature, what brings it to life is the music of the language. So, and this may be because I have these musical ancestors, but to me, as someone who has an ear, is the single most important thing.
Interesting. That's beautiful. Do you have any advice for aspiring authors?
I took, as a high school student, a couple of writing courses from Madeleine L'Engle, who was a parent in our school, our little parochial school in the Upper West Side. And she was really emphasizing always involve all the senses. Really pay attention to how things are smelling and how things are sounding and to touch. I thought that was very good advice. And I think also, I'm not so much the one who says, write what you know, which is often said, because I'm also interested in, say, Tolkien. He never met a hobbit. He didn't know what a hobbit was. When he just comes up, he's creating a term paper and he writes in the margins, in a hole in the ground lived a hobbit. He says, now why did I write that? What is a hobbit? Right? Now, of course, he is also writing what he knows, because the hobbits are sort of like little Englishmen, and it's his world, but it's also this whole other world. And so I myself think that maybe too much American literature has been rather parochial and written just to satisfy an Iowa writing school kind of inbred curriculum. And what's very nice now is how open we're becoming to the wider world. If you look at the stories published in the New Yorker, at least half of them were translated from all over the world. And I think this is a wonderful thing. So I think just reading, following your nose, reading what's most exciting to you and thinking, okay, now I could do something like that, but how do I want to do it differently?
Amazing. Thank you so much. Thank you for your wonderful book, for the tour of the world, and for talking a little bit more about it to me today. So thank you.
My pleasure. Thank you. I look forward to your book.
Thank you. Okay. Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Moms Don't Have Time to Read Books. Don't forget to follow me on Instagram at Zibby Owens and at Moms Don't Have Time to Read Books. Also sign up for my newsletter at zibbyowens.com and sign up for my virtual book club and meet lots of authors on Zoom every other week. Thanks so much to Steve and Ryan at Texture Sound for the sound editing. And thank you to Morning Moon Productions for providing this fantastic intro and outro music.